Murder News. Murder News.
Hi, spooky friends. We are thrilled that you chose to spend another Friday with us and honored that you made sure not to miss our latest episode. Each episode of the Murder News podcast also serves as a weekly meeting for our very own true crime cult.
But not to worry, you've landed in the cult with all of the flower crowns and none of the flavor aid. Take a seat around the fire, cuddle up to a baby goat, and get ready as we dig into true crime history and pull up another frightening tale of murder.
If you're just finding us now, allow us to introduce ourselves, your charismatic leaders. I'm Angelina, and I'm here with my sinister sister, Aurora. How's it going?
Pretty good. Settling into World War III vibes and just accepting it's what's happening. How about you?
You're in stride with it. Yeah, same, I guess. Adjusting to whatever this constantly readjusted new normal is. And we're getting by. We're moving on. Whatever. We're living.
We are still accepting pledges to the MMN commune. It's easier than ever to join our blossoming true crime community. Just pop over to patreon.com/murdernews and sign up for just a few bucks a month. Your support helps keep the true crime lights on, and to show you how much we appreciate it, we'll give you your own fancy title like Grandmaster of Goats, a shout out on the show, and you'll have exclusive access to our regular Patreon-only content.
Let's check out some of the true crime stories that have been making headlines this week.
California woman Sherry Papini, who you might remember staged her own kidnapping back in 2016, has been arrested. Papini's ruse prompted a 3-week search of Northern California and other states and wasted over $30,000 of resources, including ambulance services and therapy. She had claimed to have been abducted by 2 masked women, forced into a closet with only kitty litter for a toilet, and beaten badly. Prosecutors say Papini's injuries were self-inflicted and that the search for Papini wasted more than $150,000 of taxpayer money. The fake abduction was arranged to cover up the fact that the married mother of 2 was spending time with an ex-boyfriend. Papini faces charges of making false statements to a federal investigator and mail fraud, and could serve a maximum of 25 years in prison and owe up to $500,000 in fines.
Wow.
Yeah.
It was really elaborate. I remember too her descriptions of the abuse that she allegedly suffered and who her captors were and what was going on. It sounded like a movie, like stuff that doesn't really happen.
Yeah.
Real just over the top.
I don't really know anything about this case. Somehow, I just totally snoozed on it the first time it was in the news. And the second time, I've just been kind of in chaos land here in Budapest. So I just not had the bandwidth to kind of investigate on my own. But it just reminds me though, there's an alternative to this story was maybe in 2008, there was a woman that I can't remember her name, who was kidnapped, and she really was kidnapped. And her boyfriend had, they were trying to extort her boyfriend for money, but they actually kidnapped the wrong girlfriend. They were supposed to kidnap his last ex that he had just broken up with, and he started dating this girl. Either way, it wasn't going to be good. It wasn't a good thing. But nonetheless, they ended up with this woman, and they put her in a trunk of a car and drove her for hours and hours and hours while she's drugged. She doesn't know where she is. And she manages to get out, she's been raped, but pretty terrible, but as far as she's concerned, relatively unscathed. They fed her, they sat and chatted with her. She's it could have been worse. It wasn't great, but it could have been much worse. And when she finally got out, she went to the police and they didn't believe her. They thought it was a Gone Girl kind of scam. And even worse than that, she's been through all this trauma. The media made her out to be this villain. And it's just like, it's so wild. There's actually a great episode of Criminal about this that came out, I don't know, maybe like in the past like 6 weeks or something. And like, it's just like so wild. It's so hard to believe. And you're kind of like, wait, was she lying? Like, what is the story? Like, what's going on?
Wow.
But then like a police officer like was investigating the case like years later after the police department had like ruined her reputation. Friends and family had turned against her. They all thought she had made this up. And she's like living her life like in another city, like trying to start over and trying to have some like anonymity.
Wow.
And then like there was another victim that this guy tried to do it to, that it was a botched kidnapping. He like gets to their house. It's an older couple. They manage to fight him off and like they get his cell phone away from him so the police can track him down with the cell phone. And when they go find this guy where he lives, they find duct tape with blonde hair that like matches the DNA of this girl. And they prove like finally that she was kidnapped undoubtedly by this man. And all this time, the police department had like made her into this like Gone Girl villain, like kind of thing.
That's so unbelievable. Like, obviously, you got to give the person the benefit of the doubt until you see any sort of proof that they might be making it up, because what purpose would they have in making it up if they're, you know, like in the Sherry Papini story, the more you look, the more you're like, okay, she's got a lot of motive for making this up. And it does sound pretty implausible. And there's like no proof that any of it would have actually occurred. But in like ordinary situations, for the vast majority of people, I mean, like they have no benefit of making up or staging a kidnapping against themselves.
Exactly. So like the fact that police would ever start off on this footing, like it's literally like somebody in the police force in California had just read Gone Girl or seen the movie and was like, this sounds too much like that book I read. Like this must be fiction. So it's like these should always be investigated as if they are real until you just have absurd amount of evidence that they're not.
Yeah. And then on the flip side, this situation with Sherry Papini, I know like some of the issue was that like in the beginning, she was saying that she was, her captors were 2 masked Hispanic women. So she's like playing into, you know, racist stereotypes and, you know, implying that those people are criminals, fictional people that don't exist, you know. So like that's kind of messy and gross and just like,
very gross.
You know, I'm glad that they found that was, you know, not correct and that she's facing some actual trouble for this because like classic entitled white lady thinks like, no big deal. I'll make up a story and I'll get to go see my ex-boyfriend and no one will be the wiser. But that is not how you do it.
And like cases like this, unfortunately, make people that really are kidnapped, that people doubt their stories, look bad. And everyone's like, well, remember Sherry Papini? Like maybe this lady's lying too. So it's just don't do it.
Terrible.
It's really
Please
bad
do
for
not.
Other survivors too. It like really gives them a bad name as well.
The body of missing Florida woman, Cynthia Cole, was discovered floating in the septic tank behind her home in Jensen Beach this past weekend. The 57-year-old was reported missing after she was last seen by her friends at the Jammin' Jensen Art Festival. With the discovery of the woman's body, police have arrested her handyman of the past few years, 34-year-old Keoki Hilo Demick, who was caught on surveillance footage using his employer's car after her disappearance. The Martin County Sheriff's Office said the medical examiner is now in the process of completing an autopsy on Miss Cole to determine the details of her death.
We'll be right back after a quick commercial break from one of our favorite Darkcast podcasts.
Welcome to Brew Crime, a true crime and beer podcast.
This is a podcast where we pick a theme, cover a few cases, and pair them with craft beer.
Join me, Mike.
And me, JT.
As we explore the world of crime, conspiracies, or whatever catches our attention. You can find us on social media at Brewcrime or our website, brewcrime.com. And you can find us on any podcast app at Brewcrime Podcast.
Join us as we discuss the horrible crimes that surround us and maybe, probably, definitely tip a bottle or two back as you do it. Drink with us the second and last Tuesday of every month.
And we're back.
Now, before we get into our story, we just want to say that while our tone is light in the intro, we do take the topics we're discussing very seriously. We are best buds and we love chatting together every week and turning it into a podcast. We want to share that passion with you and to create a vibe where all of you feel like our best buds too. We joke about us friends forming a cult or commune, but that's not to diminish the severity of actual cult activity, which we do occasionally talk about in our weekly stories. We feel it's important to open up and talk about even the darkest aspects of humanity and the downright scary things that come up in the news. But we want to make it clear that our intention is never to sensationalize, and we always try to deliver these stories with respect to all parties involved or affected by the crimes we discuss.
We always post our sources in the episode description, so you can do some digging on your own if a story we present piques your interest. But you should know that if you ever feel we get it wrong, either in our tone or in the details of the case, we want to hear about it. We are more than happy to make a correction or give an update on a case we've discussed in previous episodes. So feel free to reach out to us at murdermurdernews@gmail.com. Some specific trigger warnings for this episode include child sexual abuse and exploitation, and graphic descriptions of brutal violence. So if any of those are particularly sensitive subjects for you, you may want to skip this one and listen to one of our other episodes instead.
Last week, we talked about the escape of two young kidnapping victims, 14-year-old Stephen Stayner and 5-year-old Timmy White, as they fled their captor and hitchhiked into Ukiah, California in March of 1980. 19 years later, in March of 1999, things came crashing down for Cary Stayner, Stephen's older brother, who was 38 years old at the time. Stephen wasn't around to witness it because he had died 10 years earlier. As we touched on in last week's episode, Stephen lived just 9 short years after his escape from a captor who held him for 7 years. He died at the age of 24 in a motorcycle crash. Maybe the loss of his little brother was what pushed Cary Stayner over the edge, but there certainly were a lot of red flags along the way and too many traumatic events in Cary's history to pinpoint one reason why he snapped.
Let's rewind way back to Cary's early childhood, long before his brother Stephen's disappearance. Cary was born on August 13th, 1972, and he was the firstborn child of Delbert and Kay Stayner, who would go on to have 5 children in total. Cary's first sibling, a little sister, arrived when he was about 3 years old. Also around that time, Cary was diagnosed with trichotillomania, which is a compulsive hair pulling disorder. It usually results in bald spots and patchy hair on the scalp, eyebrows, and eyelashes. It also impacts social functioning and is typically treated with a combination of counseling and antidepressant medication. By the sound of things, Cary's trichotillomania went untreated and continued well into adulthood. As we mentioned in last week's episode, the Stayners were pretty religious, and they were also Mormon. Unlike a lot of fundamentalist offshoots of Christianity, the Mormon Church doesn't necessarily condemn the use of antidepressant medications or psychotherapy, though they would prefer that their followers seek counseling and spiritual guidance at church before resorting to seeing a psychiatrist. The Stayners themselves didn't seem to have a particularly modern view on therapy. As we mentioned in the episode about Stephen Stayner, when he returned to his family after 7 years of abuse at the hands of his abductor, Kenneth Parnell, his family forbade him from seeing a psychiatrist to help him heal from that trauma. So we can only imagine that Kay and Delbert Stayner likely had similar outlooks towards dealing with young Cary back in the 60s. Stephen Stayner was born in 1965 when Cary was 4 years old. The family was growing fast, and Cary already felt like he was fighting for attention from his parents, who were juggling 3 children under 5 years old. That does sound like a lot.
Yes.
Soon, 2 younger sisters arrived, and nobody noticed there was something a little off about Cary. He recalls having his first fantasy about violence against women when he was 7 years old. When his mom was busy shopping, Cary would sit and wait for her at the front of the store, facing the checkouts. All the while, he would think about what it might be like to kill one of the store's cashiers.
By 11, he had directed his violent fantasies towards his mother, imagining her being kidnapped by an intruder. Shortly thereafter, his little brother Stephen was actually kidnapped, and Cary saw his father cry for the first time. His parents were rather cold and preferred to bottle up their emotions rather than express them, and it seems that they expected the same of their children. Cary's fantasies grew darker. He called on mental images of the Holocaust that he had learned about in school, but replaced the Jews with marching naked women. He channeled his energy into illustration, which nobody at home seemed to realize that he was really amazing at. However, by 7th grade, Cary was recognized for his academic ability and placed into the gifted class. Cary was having an especially hard time at home since the disappearance of his little brother. The boys had been close, and the family remembers Cary wishing on stars that Stephen would come home. All of the children felt neglected after Stephen went missing, as their parents were preoccupied with his disappearance. They consulted with psychics and would drive for hours just to search a new spot in hopes of finding Stephen or to chase after any small tip called in about their son. While Stephen was away, his siblings endured their own unspoken trauma. If you tuned in last week, you'll know that Cary Stayner's father was permitted to live on the family's property, despite the fact that he molested her while she was growing up. She felt like she could keep an eye on him and prevent him from hurting her children. But what we didn't have time to get into last week was that while Kay was busy looking the other way, she didn't notice the abuse that her children suffered at the hands of her husband. In 1986, Delbert Stayner was charged with molesting his daughters and ordered into therapy by state authorities. The abuse seems to have started while the girls were pretty young, but we're not certain whether it began before or after Stephen's disappearance. Meanwhile, Cary was being molested by his uncle, Delbert's brother, Jesse Stayner. Although Jesse was a convicted child molester, and that fact was widely known among all the male cousins in the family, the boys were all still permitted to go to Jesse's place for sleepovers. A Stayner relative once told psychiatrist George Woods that child sexual abuse, quote, has been going on for so long, it's like a sickness in the family. I guess this is where that mentality of ignore it and it'll go away that we spoke of last week came into play. It never did go away. Instead, Cary perpetuated the cycle of abuse. He and several other neighborhood boys went streaking one day in front of a group of young girls. He exposed himself on several occasions to his younger sister and her friends. When he was 16, Cary molested and exposed himself to his sister's friend, Florence Tatum, during a sleepover.
Wow, it's just shocking to hear how much abuse was in their family, and it's a little bit like easier to wrap your brain around like why they didn't think that Stephen needed therapy. It's like if they all grew up in this for so long, it unfortunately must have seemed like the really messed up normal. Like,
It's like, so you had, sexual abuse like all of us, and what?
Right.
Yeah.
Gosh, so sad. When Stephen returned in 1980, Cary Stayner was 19. I think Cary had expected that the return of his little brother would bring his family closer together and that his parents would suddenly have more time for him and his siblings. Now they didn't have to spend any time searching for Stephen. When things didn't quite pan out like that, Cary was heartbroken. Stephen didn't feel as close with his older brother as he once had, and he couldn't bounce back from the trauma he had endured. He didn't appreciate it when Cary would try to stick up for him in face of neighborhood bullies. The Stayner children's relationship with their parents had suffered some irreparable damage in the face of Stephen's disappearance. There was no going back to the way things used to be. On the contrary, the Stayners were now at the center of a media frenzy. Cary sunk back into the shadows as his family met with crime authors and consulted on TV miniseries about Stephen's ordeal. Cary's rock-bottom self-esteem was on full display during the production of the miniseries when writer J.P. Miller visited the Stayners and saw some of Cary's illustrations. He suggested Cary should send them off to some colleges in search of a scholarship, and Cary shrugged it off, insisting that would never happen. Struggling with the return to normal family life, Stephen Stayner soon found himself kicked out of the family home in Merced, California. Cary also left home, moving in with his uncle, Jesse Stayner. Stephen got married and had some children of his own. Then in 1989, he died in a motorcycle crash. Cary, who was 28 years old at the time, confided in a friend that he felt he was having a nervous breakdown. He told his friend that he felt like getting in his truck and driving into the office of the glass company he worked at and killing his boss and everybody in there and then torching the place. The following year, Cary's uncle Jesse, who he lived with, was murdered while at home from work on his lunch break. Wow, this family.
Right?
Yeah. According to the autopsy report, Jesse died from a single gunshot to the chest from a small caliber handgun. A neighbor noticed Jesse's front door wide open and peeked inside to find his dead body on the floor of his home. Stayner's 1989 Chevrolet Silverado, which was silver and burgundy, went missing after the murder and was assumed to have been stolen by his killer. Jesse's murder is still considered unsolved, and no suspects or motive have ever been identified in the case. Speculation is that Cary murdered his uncle after enduring years of molestation, but at this point, we may never know.
The year after that, Cary attempted suicide using carbon monoxide from his truck, but he survived. When he was 34, Cary checked himself into the Merced County Mental Health Department, saying he was having a mental breakdown. They held him for a few days of treatment, then released him. At 36, he allegedly tried his hand in the business of medical marijuana. I guess he must have taken the black market route because he was arrested that year on marijuana and methamphetamine charges. His mobile home was repossessed. Cary Stayner caught a break when he was offered the live-in handyman position at Cedar Lodge in Yosemite National Park in 1997. Oddly, Yosemite was where his brother Stephen's captor, Kenneth Parnell, was working when he met his partner in luring children, Irvin Murphy. Cary's coworkers remember him as quiet but friendly enough, unassuming enough to slip right under the radar in March of 1999 when police were interviewing park staff in search of possible suspects in the recent murders of a woman and 2 teenage girls.
Carol and Jent's son lived in Eureka, California, and welcomed their first daughter, Juliana, in 1983. After the birth of their daughter, they started taking in foster children. A few years later, they adopted a couple of children from Africa after learning how much less likely Black children were to be adopted. Carol volunteered with groups that helped victimized children. She joined the NAACP. She taught parenting classes and worked with developmentally disabled adults living in group homes who wanted to establish independence. In short, she was a living angel. Carol met her good friend Raquel Palesso when she traveled to Argentina back in the 1970s. They kept in touch, and both women married and had children. The sons traveled to Argentina as a family years later, and Carol and Jent looked into adopting an Argentinian child. Juliana, who went by Julie, made fast friends with Raquel's daughter, Sylvania. When Sylvania had the opportunity to travel to America on a student exchange as a teenager, she jumped at the chance. She moved to Eureka and lived with the sons and went to high school with Julie. Julie was a pretty amazing girl, too. She was a budding activist and started an anti-rape campaign at her high school after learning that 2 of her friends had been sexually assaulted. That's so amazing, especially during this era.
Yeah. On February 12th, 1999, Carol's son, 15-year-old Julie, and 16-year-old Sylvania left their home in Eureka for a vacation near Yosemite National Park. Jent couldn't join them because he had to prepare for an upcoming business trip to Arizona, which was unfortunate because Yosemite was special to Carol and Jent. They had honeymooned in the park. Carol and the girls first flew to San Francisco, where Carol rented a red Pontiac Grand Prix. Next, they drove to Stockton, California for a cheerleading competition at the University of the Pacific that Julie performed in. Then it was on to Cedar Lodge. The 3 were last seen alive while eating in the diner after renting some videos from the service desk at the lodge on February 15th. It was pretty ordinary for guests to check out of Cedar Lodge by leaving the room key on the table and leaving the front door unlocked. As such, no one was surprised when Carol's son didn't appear at the front desk on the morning of February 16th to check out in person. What Carol and the girls hadn't realized is that they were the only guests in the whole building that night. The lodge didn't actually employ full-time daily maid staff, particularly during the off-season. With few guests, they found the solution was to book a new clean room for each new guest and leave the rooms that had been recently rented empty until the end of the week when the maid would come and clean all the rooms at once. The staff at the lodge would have known that if any foul play went down in any of the rooms, it would be a long while before anyone would discover the evidence. And the period between the group's stay and the maid's visit was also plenty long enough to allow for an attacker to cover his tracks and clean up the evidence so it would never be discovered. The rental car hadn't been returned on time, but it was the company's policy to extend the rental for as long as credit card payments were approved before reporting a vehicle stolen.
Wow.
Yeah.
Jen's son had planned to travel to San Francisco with their other children, meet Carol, Julie, and Sylvania there, and they would all fly together to Arizona. While he was in business meetings, the rest of the family would see the Grand Canyon. Jen's flight was over 5 hours late, so when he couldn't find Carol at the airport, he assumed she had grown tired of waiting, and he and the other kids went on to Arizona. When they never arrived, he reported Carol, Julie, and Sylvania missing. Initially, authorities assumed they had wandered off and gotten lost while hiking, as is common in national parks, or that they had a car accident somewhere and hadn't yet been discovered. FBI agent Jeff Rinnick described the extensive searches led by the Mariposa County Sheriff's Department as some of the most thorough he had ever seen. There were ground-penetrating radar, sonar, air patrol, ground patrol, etc., etc. After 4 weeks of searching the trails and surrounding wilderness, the investigation was thrown off course when Carol's wallet was found in Modesto, California, which is about 90 miles from the crime scene. After 2 weeks of investigators racking their brains to find a possible explanation for all of this, lead of the investigation, FBI agent James Maddock, said in a press release at the end of February, quote, "We feel almost certain that the women were victims of a violent crime."
Those suspicions were confirmed after a grisly discovery in the morning of March 19th, 1999. A hiker had stumbled upon a burnt-out red Pontiac in Stanislaus Forest and called the police. A $50,000 reward had been offered to anyone who found the missing rental car, and the hiker was quick to remove the license plate from the car before walking to the nearest payphone to report it. The California Highway Patrol ran the license plate number and confirmed this to be the missing rental car of Carol Sund, and the hiker got the reward. They called in the FBI, who opened the trunk to find 2 charred bodies inside. Dental records helped to identify the two as Carol Sund and Sylvania Peloso. Less than a week later, authorities received an anonymous letter leading them to the location of Juliana Sund and taunting them about the depravity of her murder. Quote, "We had fun with this one," the letter stated. "We had our way with her." Julie's badly decomposed body was found in a thicket of dense brush overlooking Don Pedro Lake, about 60 miles from Yosemite. Her throat had been cut. Giving the killer's choice of hiding spots, police figured they were looking for someone familiar with the area. Carol Sund's rental car had been dumped in an area where locals often dumped old refrigerators, broken washing machines, and write-off cars. Don Pedro Lake, where Julie was found, is in Tulum County. The reservoir, as locals call it, sees hobby fishermen and weekenders staying at nearby B&Bs and campgrounds year-round. Investigators began interviews in search of a perpetrator living in the Central Sierra or San Joaquin Valley, and initially they were only considering possible suspects with criminal histories. Cary Stayner wasn't considered to have a criminal history to speak of. In the hills of California, one investigator said, "If all you've got is one pot bust, you might as well be a Boy Scout." Investigators zeroed in on 2 meth addicts from Modesto named Mick Larwick and Eugene Rufus Dykes. The pair were half-brothers with extensive criminal records. Mick was already in jail after allegedly shooting a Modesto police officer, and Rufus had made a false confession to the murders. The way the letter they had received was worded, it did sound like the murders had been committed by more than one offender. Even when they realized they had been duped, investigators had a long list of potential suspects that didn't include Cary Stayner.
Police questioned 24-year-old Kenneth Soldier Stewart, a former cellmate of Rufus Dykes, who had been charged with attempted murder. They also talked to Maria Ledbetter, fellow meth addict and former girlfriend of Dykes, and Angelia Dale, a friend of both Larwick and Dykes. They examined 42-year-old Billy Joe Strange, who worked at the Cedar Lodge Diner, where Carol and the girls were last seen and was already on parole. Their list of potential suspects to interview included a surprising number of employees of the Cedar Lodge. The idea that a tourist accommodation near a national park might be staffed by so many with criminal records and even on parole is a little concerning. Yeah. It certainly adds to the image of national parks as dangerous predator hunting grounds, shrouded in quiet wilderness, which is definitely how I feel about them, even though they're pretty.
So beautiful and sounds like such a
Deadly.
fun camping trip, but too
Yeah.
scary to carry out because, oh my God.
Agreed. They also checked out Strange's roommate, a 55-year-old man named Daryl Gray Stevens. He was a convicted sex offender that had also done time for robbery. Investigators considered 36-year-old fraudster Rachel Lou Campbell, who coincidentally had Carol Son's checking account number and ATM PIN in her possession when she was arrested for a mail scam in April of 99. They looked at 41-year-old Larry Dwayne Utley, who'd been arrested on an unrelated charge, 36-year-old Teresa Kay, who failed to appear in court in Modesto on a drug charge, and 32-year-old Jeffrey Wayne Keeney, who'd been arrested on an unrelated drug charge. The case garnered a lot of media attention and became known as Yosemite Sightseer Murders or the Yosemite Park Murders. One of the reasons why I've always been attracted to true crime is that I spend a lot of time processing the worst thing that can happen and kind of planning my escape route if I were to be abducted or find myself on a scary Tinder date. But sometimes I get true crime overload, which leads me to setting up booby traps around my apartment like I'm Kevin McAllister, self-medicating with wine, and struggling with falling asleep.
I'm so glad that we talk about therapy so much in this community, and I've learned so much about cognitive behavior therapy from the work I've done and how I can use those tools to calm down when my mind is racing or imagining there could be a serial killer hiding in my closet. We've been using this great app, Nuna, that uses CBT methods in this cool chat function, which helps me get a hold of my thoughts and feel like a friend is helping talk me back to a more reasonable state of mind.
You can try Nuna right now to help with your mental well-being and get 25% off when you use our link to sign up. Just go to landing.nuna.ai/MMN or just click on the link in our show notes for your 25% discount.
Let Nuna help convince you that the noise you heard outside your door is probably just your cat up to their usual hijinks. Though he had been interviewed, as had everyone working at Cedar Lodge that weekend, no one looked very closely at Cary Stayner until he was arrested in connection with another case, the murder of Joie Armstrong in July of 1999. Joie Ruth Armstrong was 26 years old from Orlando and always smiling. She was a bit of a hippie and landed herself the perfect happy hippie job working as an environmental educator, which she'd been doing for about a year. She worked on a program for children run by the Yosemite Institute in partnership with the National Parks Network. She lived among other park workers in a communal setting in the Foresta community, which consisted of about 30 cabins in the woods on a stream. On July 22nd, Joey's friend in Sausalito, California, called the local police department to report her missing. She had been expected to arrive for a visit and never showed up. Responding officers found signs of a struggle in her cabin and a trail of evidence leading to the stream nearby, where they found her body. Joie had been decapitated, her body left on the bank, and her head tossed into the stream that the Foresta community got their drinking water from. Neighbors had reported seeing a baby blue International Scout nearby to Joey's cabin on the 21st, the day she was likely murdered. The International Scout is a unique car with a different tread on each of its 4 tires, which also made it easy to identify tire tracks in the mud near to where Joey's body was found, as left by the Scout. Locals knew the car as belonging to Cary Stayner, who lived and worked at Cedar Lodge.
Authorities came upon Stayner on the bank of the Merced River, completely nude and smoking a joint, and a bit out of it. They gave him a ticket for the joint, but didn't talk to him much at the moment, deciding they would follow up with him at the Cedar Lodge later on. At this point, Stayner wasn't even a suspect in Armstrong's murder. Police only wanted to interview him as a possible witness. For the first time since he started work at the lodge, Cary didn't show up to work the next day. Other workers at the lodge recalled him frantically trying to sell off his belongings before he took off. This made him look all the more suspect, so investigators worked to track him down. A bolo was issued for Cary Stayner with a physical description and a description of his vehicle. On July 23rd, Janet DeMont called the FBI from the Laguna del Sol nudist colony, saying she had met a man matching the description on the bolo at a bar at the resort. When FBI agent Jeff Reineck and John Bull showed up at Laguna del Sol, the manager of the bar told them to head inside and look for the only guy with clothes on. They brought Stayner in for questioning. During the ride to the police station, they asked Cary if he was related to kidnapping survivor Steven Stayner, and Cary got all choked up about it. He asked Agent Reineck if he felt it was just that Kenneth Parnell only served 5 years in prison while Steven was being held captive for 7 years. And Reineck responded that it was absolutely unjust.
Now retired FBI agent Jeff Reineck wrote a book about the cases that stuck with him during his work in the FBI called In the Name of the Children. I went to download it from Audible, and it was actually a free selection for Audible members, so I dug in right away. I intended to skip right to the chapter about Cary Stayner's crimes, but it was so good that I got distracted and just kept listening from the beginning. So I would highly recommend it. Reineck talks about keeping humanity in his investigations and how he got all of his confessions by finding a way to relate to the suspect and appeal to their own humanity. He acknowledged that people are never all good or all bad, which I love to hear from law enforcement because it feels like more often when I hear from them, I'm hearing about monsters and pure evil. He also acknowledged that maintaining that compassionate perspective throughout his career came with some pretty heavy consequences. He has attempted suicide and had breakdowns and near breakdowns, but he maintains that it feels like a better option than letting yourself grow cold and hardened, which a lot of agents and police officers do, allowing them to pull off calculated tactics like playing the bad cop in a good cop, bad cop routine. Agent Reineck and Cary Stayner made some kind of connection just in the short trip to the police station, and that connection inspired Stayner to confess. First, he tried to negotiate, explaining that he had heard about some reward money, and his parents had had a hard life that would be improved if they had that money. He wanted his parents to get the reward money in exchange for his confession, and he wanted to be housed in the new penitentiary being built in his hometown. He also wanted the FBI to supply him with, quote, a good-sized stack of child pornography.
Ugh.
Yeah. He claimed he had never seen child pornography, but his curiosity about it burned him up inside. He said he couldn't risk going away to jail forever without having seen it. But if they brought him child porn, he could happily go away for life. They agreed to comply with exactly 0 of Stayner's demands, but Stayner quickly got to confessing anyway. He said he hadn't intended to kill Joie Armstrong at first, but the urge struck him as he watched her make several trips between her cabin and her car, packing for the trip she was supposed to go on, and watering her garden. He struck up a conversation, then pulled a gun and pushed his way into her cabin, threatening to rob her. Next, he tied Joie up, sexually assaulted her, and dragged her into his truck where he sexually assaulted her again. He drove away with Joie bound in the passenger seat, but she wriggled out the open window and fell from the moving vehicle onto the road, trying to escape. This enraged Stayner, who lost control. He dragged her deeper into the woods as she kept trying to break free. He stabbed towards her neck, trying to slit her throat, but Joie thrust her chin into her chest to block the blade. He pulled her head up by the hair and stabbed so viciously at her throat that her head was nearly severed, and she went limp. Cary said he didn't mean to decapitate her, but she put up such a fight that things didn't go according to his plan. Stayner grabbed Armstrong by the leg and dragged her towards the stream, leaving behind a trail of blood. He scrambled to cover his tracks with dirt and pine needles that just sort of mixed in with the blood, and he knew then he wouldn't get away with it. Stayner went on to explain that he had also killed Carol and Julie Sund and Sylvania Peloso. He speculated that his actions that night had ignited a murderous spark in him, and he could no longer resist his urges by the time he saw Joie Armstrong outside her cabin. He was on a roll.
Stayner kept talking to detail the events of the February night at the Cedar Lodge. In his handyman garb, he paid a visit to room 509. Carol's son answered, and Cary strangled her with a rope and then shot her and pushed his way into the room. He tied up Julie and raped Sylvania, then strangled her in the bathtub. With the dead bodies of her mother and friend in the room, Stayner raped Julie. He placed Carol and Sylvania's bodies in the trunk of the rental car and drove off with Julie, who he says he continued to sexually assault several times, and he forced her to perform oral sex on him, quote, for hours. He torched the rental car and brought Julie to the lake, where he slit her throat so fiercely that she was nearly decapitated. He went on to describe his unfulfilled plan to murder his girlfriend, a one-time coworker of Cedar Lodge, and rape and kill her 2 young daughters the day after Valentine's Day. Once Stayner started talking, he couldn't stop. Investigators later recalled that Stayner listed off his murderous acts, quote, like he was reading a soup label. He acted so cold and unaffected by any of it. Investigators confiscated his backpack, which Stayner was known to carry everywhere, which even his girlfriend's daughters remembered about him. This backpack was revealed to be a murder kit containing knives, duct tape, gloves, and rope. While Stayner confessed, investigators searched his workplace, home, and truck and found plenty of evidence indicating his involvement in all 4 murders. Room 509 at the Cedar Lodge was again searched, with hairs of the scene matched to Stayner. Joie Armstrong's cabin was searched, and bodily fluids matching Cary Stayner's were found on site.
Cary Stayner asked to meet with TV executives and said he wanted to sell the rights to his story to the highest bidder, who would make the best film about him. It seemed he was making one last grab at the fame he had dreamt of ever since his little brother's abduction and escape made headlines. Because she was killed on federal land, Stayner was tried for Joie Armstrong's murder in federal court. To avoid the death penalty, he pleaded guilty to premeditated first-degree murder, felony first-degree murder, kidnapping resulting in death, and attempted aggravated sexual abuse resulting in death. Much to everyone's astonishment, Stayner broke down in front of the jury and made a tearful apology, wishing he could take it all back. In the murders of Carol and Julie Sund and Sylvania Peloso, Stayner attempted to plead not guilty by reason of insanity and claimed to have dissociative identity disorder, saying one of his alter personalities committed the murders. He blamed his bizarre list of demands in exchange for his confession on a manifestation of his obsessive-compulsive disorder. He was examined by a psychiatrist who confirmed he had obsessive-compulsive disorder, mild autism, and paraphilia. Still, he was declared legally sane and convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances and 1 count of kidnapping by a jury on August 27, 2002. Stayner was sentenced to death in 2002 and entered housing in the Adjustment Center on death row in San Quentin Penitentiary in California. As we mentioned in earlier episodes of the podcast, Governor Gavin Newsom declared a moratorium on executions in the state of California, and none have been performed since 2006. Cary Stayner remains on death row to this day.
Wow, what a family. Whew.
I know. It just makes you wonder, like, where does it end? You know, like, what if we follow down the road of investigating any other family member and what became of their life?
Right.
Like, I just feel like there's going to be more horror at every turn. Like, it's just spreading through
every single
the whole community,
one.
the whole family, like a virus.
So terrible.
Yeah. So have you been watching anything murdery?
I did watch some interesting things this weekend.
Oh, yeah?
I watched Fresh on Hulu. Have you heard of this?
Oh, I have heard about it, and I added it to my list, but I haven't watched it yet.
It's very good. It's like starts off like a rom-com and then quickly turns into a very fascinating horror movie. Horror thriller. It's very good, very weird, very messed up, and quite empowering by the end. So I definitely recommend checking that out.
All right.
So that was probably the best of it. And then I also watched, I watched another movie, this one on Netflix, The Weekend Away. Have you heard of this?
I don't think so.
That one it stars one of the people from Gossip Girl. It's, gosh, I
Okay.
can't think of her name. It's like Leighton Meister. I'm not sure how to say her name.
Yeah.
But she plays Blair on Gossip Girl, who is just like the best, like villain / main character / like just like disastrous, like diva. She's great. And so she and her friend meet up in Croatia for like a girls' weekend, and her friend disappears. And like, this isn't a spoiler. This is all in the description if you look it up on Netflix. Like, I don't want to give away too much, but then the friend is found dead and the murder is like pinned on the main character.
Ooh.
And so she's like trying to prove her innocence, and while trying to like solve her friend's murder and like whatever at the same time. Like, it's quite the wild ride. It's pretty good. It's kind of a little bit like soapy, but like definitely like a good weekend watch, and kind of like a Gone Girl kind of, like hyped up kind of thing. It was good.
That's fun. Both of those things sound like a similar vibe, which I like, the sort of juxtaposition of one genre with another, like a soap and murder, or a rom-com and murder. I like it.
Yeah.
I watched the movie, which I think is on Netflix, The United States versus Billie Holiday. Did you see that, or are you familiar with the story? So I'm a bit of a fan of hers, but I guess I didn't know too much about the actual story. Her song, Strange Fruit, which is about the lynching of Black people in the South, enraged so many white people and cops that they banned her from performing it. They would show up at her shows and just arrest her if she started to sing that song. Wow. And she had so much trouble with the law because of that. She struggled with a heroin addiction also, which she constantly got in trouble for because they always wanted to get her for something. Because they were so mad about this song. And she was like, it's about human rights. It's very important, like I'm singing it for a reason, and they just kept taking so many shots at her that they really broke her down by the end of it, which is horrible. But it does say a lot about, the early police, the foundation of the police as slave patrol, and then the just white supremacy that continued in that organization into this time. And that's why they were so enraged about this song. So that's pretty astounding. They even had FBI agents posing as her friends and lovers and things like that to get information on her, which is just, more than I ever realized was going on. So that's very...
I had no idea. I'm
it's
definitely
a really
going to
good
check
movie.
that out. That sounds really good. Where did you watch it?
I think it was on Netflix.
Okay, great.
Yeah. And then the other thing I watched was also on Netflix, a series called The Worst Roommate Ever. Have you heard of this?
I watched that too.
I watched the whole thing. Did you watch the whole thing?
I think I took a nap through the last episode of it, but I saw the others.
The last one, like it was interesting, but it wasn't the best of the stories. I'm not sure why they saved it for last, but like the first one was really something. Yeah. I just wow, blown away. So I thought I had some terrible roommate experiences, but I have nothing on any of the people in this series, which like their roommates became murderous or like serial squatters or like all sorts of really disturbing scenarios. So I would totally recommend that as well. Very, I just ate it up.
Yeah, it was
I watched it all in like a day or two.
Yeah, good stuff. One of these days I'm going to have to get my mom on the show because this is shocking. I got a text from my mom the other day saying that she had like repressed a memory from her childhood and that it has recently come back up, and she just felt like she needed to share it with me and like other women in general, just as a kind of like reminder about how like bad the world can be and about like getting help for like trauma. But she just recalled that when she was 13, she was kidnapped.
Oh my God. And she totally blocked that out.
She blocked it out, and it was two men that one was 18 and one was 23, that they were supposed to meet up with like a friend of hers who was like an older girl, and they were just going to like drive around this like square in Ohio and then maybe all go see like a park-in movie, like a drive-in movie together. And the friend couldn't come. My mom didn't know, this is like obviously before, like in the 60s for cell phones and such.
Cell phones, yeah.
Yeah. So like she met up and the boys like convinced her to come with them, and she did. And they ended up kidnapping her for 2 days. And the police were called in, like it's on the news, like whatever. And
wow.
And like she managed to like convince them that she could call her friend that didn't come and get money, like get her to like bring them money. And so when they met up with the friend, the police were waiting for them. And my mom had to testify at trial. Like this went to trial. They went to jail. And like, this is something that was like so painful for her that she's like blocked it for all of these years. Like she hasn't thought about it since.
And that's such a big story to block out. Like when she started realizing, she must have just, been blown away by like, wow, there was so many moments, the moment of being kidnapped, of trying to get out of it, of going to court, so many moments that she blocked out.
I'm sure she has not regained all the memories from it. I'm sure like more bad stuff's going to come back. But a lot of it was because, unfortunately, like my grandma at the time victim blamed her and made it sound like it was something shameful she did getting in this car with boys and like whatever.
So it was just a lot more comfortable to forget it.
Right. It was more comfortable to forget it because she couldn't talk to anybody about it. Like probably similar to like this, the Stayners. Like it's just like, let's push this under the rug and not deal with it.
Oof. Like I really hope that, as time goes on, we have less and less of those attitudes because we're learning how toxic they are and how much it does sweep under the rug that, maybe needs a little light shone on it instead of being so ignored. So like, I hope that, we have less and less families like this that like to keep things under wrap and blame each other. And,
agreed. And I feel so happy that she felt like she could finally talk about it and that she's recovering the memories and she felt comfortable and safe enough opening up to me. So, so we'll try to get her on to talk about it.
Well, yeah, if she ever does want to come on the show, that would be really fun. But
for sure.
But wow, like that's got to be a lot to process. So
I'm sure. Yeah.
Well, I guess that's enough murder for 1 week. If you need more, make sure to bookmark murdermurder.news to stay up to date with the latest breaking true crime stories all week, every week.
And please also follow us on Instagram at Murder Murder News, on Twitter at Murder News, at TikTok at Murder Murder News, and on Facebook, you can find our page by searching for Murder Murder News.
And while you're there, you can also join our Facebook group, which will also pop up when you search for Murder Murder News. Group members can look under the events tab to find all the info you need about any upcoming events, including our monthly book club meetings. This month, we're reading The Good House by Tananarive Due, and it is another long one. So if you want to join us on Zoom Sunday, March 27th, you had better get reading.
Note to myself. And if you like what you've been hearing each week on this podcast, let us know by leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. And make sure to subscribe to our show on your preferred podcast platform so you never miss an episode.
Have a good week.
Bye, friends.
Bye.